This year, we commemorate 70 years since the end of the Second World War. Looking back at the global coalition of states that was aligned by 1945 against the Axis powers, it is easy to assume that our victory and their defeat were inevitable, that history could have taken no other course. Yet the map of Europe could have been entirely different from the one we know today. Imagine, May 9, 1940. Pacifist Lord Halifax is appointed British Prime Minister instead of unpopular maverick Winston Churchill. Hitler invades France and orders General von Rundstedt's tanks to push through to Dunkirk. The entire British expeditionary force is destroyed. US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, already frail, decides not to run again for president and respect the traditions of his predecessors. Isolationist Republican Wendell Willkie is elected president on November 5, 1940, and signs a non-aggression treaty with Japan. Isolated and demoralized, Britain agrees to an armistice with Nazi Germany. Hitler's Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union starts on time, on May 1, 1941. Moscow falls less than 5 months later. Leningrad and Stalingrad surrender as the USSR falls apart and Japan annexes eastern Siberia. Neutral USA and Nazi Germany develop atomic bombs at the same time and coexist from that moment in an uneasy Cold War. Latin America is ruled by right-wing dictators allied with the Reich, while most of Asia becomes part of the Japanese pro-prosperity sphere. This apocalyptic scenario, of course, didn't happen. Roosevelt and Churchill did lead their nations and changed the course of history. When Britain was left alone in battle, Churchill declared, "We shall never surrender." He did keep his word and patiently persuaded his friend, FDR, to join forces with him. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor gave Roosevelt a political cover to engage in a course of action he had already settled on, to make the world safe for democracy. Together, they stemmed the tide of Nazi barbarism and laid the foundation of the world we still live in today: the United Nations, NATO, the European Union. The future is never written. At critical points along the way, and for short periods of time, it can move in radically different directions as a result of the actions or inactions of only a few individuals. Roosevelt and Churchill, it is true, were not just any two men. They were the leaders of their nations. Yet the events which enabled them to exercise such awesome power at just the right time in history may well never have happened. And the alternate world which would have emerged at the end of that conflict seems as unreal to us here and now as the Free West was to the hundreds of millions of East Europeans caught behind what Churchill aptly called the Iron Curtain, which went on dividing the old continent from the Baltic to the Adriatic for almost 5 more decades. Today, the technological, communications, and transportation revolutions that have reshaped our lives over the past 3 decades have empowered citizens throughout the world to have a similar impact on global events as had Roosevelt and Churchill 70 years ago. The fall of the Soviet bloc, the end of apartheid in South Africa, and the Arab Spring are clear proof that the power of global civil society to affect world events has increased exponentially. And yet, without careful planning and organization, such revolutions are easily derailed by regressive and well-established power networks. In time, this can reverse civil society's hard-fought achievements and restore the same authoritarian and corrupt regimes, dressed only in different robes. In both 1989 and 2011, we should have actively supported the progressive forces of civil society in Eastern Europe and the wider Middle East. Instead, we stood by and watched how the blood and toil of their heroes were wasted in vain. Today, from Ukraine and Georgia to Iraq and Yemen, we live with the consequences of our previous inactions. Even for us, citizens of the European Union and of North America, this 70th anniversary comes at a particularly difficult moment. a global financial meltdown and economic recession unprecedented since 1929, a rise in narrow nationalisms and anti-foreigner feelings, continuing conflict and instability on our borders. All of us have experienced a marked decline in the trust we put in our political institutions and in our elected officials. This is the inevitable result of their chronic inability to seriously address some of the most urgent issues we face today: quality healthcare and education, a clean environment and global warming, hyper-urbanization and mass migrations, global epidemics, man-made and natural humanitarian disasters. Memories of having fought together against dictatorship and genocide can just still bring our politicians together for ceremonial functions, but they are at a total loss to creatively imagine how to bring about in a sustainable manner democracy, prosperity, and diversity for the 21st century. In the United States, the crisis is one of partisan politics. An institutional system of checks and balances devised 2.5 centuries ago is combined with a two-headed party system where each head, Republican and Democrat, vainly attempts to devour the other whilst forgetting that they both share the very same body. This has caused a damaging political stalemate and an increasingly dangerous loss of legitimacy of the democratic processes that have held America together since birth. The European Union presents us with a mirror image of the dynamics taking place across the Atlantic. Here, new supranational institutions were devised after 1945 to bind together the economy of 6 ravaged states in the hopes of avoiding both another disastrous conflict and a communist takeover. Today, these institutions now include 27 states, spanning both sides of the former East-West divide. Creation of political elites with little popular support and democratic legitimacy, the new European superstructure also suffers, like its American counterpart, from a fatal hubris. The EU now has a single currency, a European constitution, and the EU president. Yet no truly common EU-wide political and economic ties of solidarity and responsibility. Nothing was put in place that could have cemented the weak knees of this shaky giant when the winds of economic recession and external aggression were bound to strike. And strike they did, as we are reminded almost daily by television reports discussing the Greek social and economic crisis and the Ukrainian conflict, to name but just 2 of these events. In sum, in the United States, all the institutions of government are gridlocked by unaccountable national political parties and out-of-control electoral spending. In the EU, new central institutions are delegitimized by lack of accountable, effective, and democratic pan-European political structures. How do we prevent the current crisis of our present political institutions on both sides of the Atlantic from degenerating into a terrible social cancer whose symptoms, right-wing populism, isolationism, narrow nationalism, xenophobia and racism, have afflicted our societies before and are on the verge of doing so again? The popular wave of enthusiasm and support that carried Barack Obama to the White House floundered on the shoulders of outdated and deadlocked political institutions. The new economic and political institutional structures implemented across the EU by its political elites have failed to take hold and become effective due to their lack of popular legitimacy and support from the vast majority of its citizens. From different directions, both Europe and North America are fast approaching the same existential crisis: the de facto shutdown of their democratic political structures of government. We still have the power to bring about radical and permanent change. However, time is short because of the global and urgent nature of the challenges we now face. If we continue on the same path, we will be confronted with what Thomas Homer Dixon calls catagenesis, the virtual collapse of our social infrastructures as we know them today. We will descend in a protracted conflict for resources and livable space, where might is right and the rule of law and fairness are all but dead. Yet this crisis also gives us the greatest opportunity to bring about the change we all want, towards peace, prosperity, participation. If only we join together across borders, set a clear heading, and hold the course. Catagenesis or convergence? This is the stark choice we face today. If we act now, the future may yet turn out as we all wish it to be. If we do not, the map of our world at the next 21st century will be as different from today as the map of the pre-Columbian New World is from the current map of the Americas. The choice is ours, and our actions over the next decade will set the course for what awaits us in the not-too-distant future. For once the critical moment when numerous headings are possible passes, once we start steering in a specific direction, reversing course becomes extremely difficult, if not impossible, as we shall see in the next installment of the Lafayette Gambit.